When I showed the building manager my surgery discharge papers and explained I'd only been gone 3 weeks for a medical procedure, he just shrugged and said, "Your nephew handled all the paperwork while you were away. The lease has been transferred. It's all legal." That night, sitting in a hospital charity bed because I had nowhere else to go, I made 4 phone calls that would expose a conspiracy 20 years in the making. Within 2 months, my nephew Marcus was facing felony charges. His accomplice was evicted from my apartment, and I owned the entire building where they thought they could dispose of me like yesterday's garbage. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe and tell me in the comments, have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they were planning your downfall the entire time? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the people who think you're weak and helpless are about to discover they just made the biggest mistake of their lives. This story is about the Thursday morning when I returned from major surgery to find my entire life had been stolen by someone I'd raised and trusted like my own son. When I discovered that the nephew I'd put through college, supported through his divorce, and helped start his real estate business had been systematically positioning himself to inherit my assets while I was still very much alive. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and for the past 15 years, I'd been living in apartment 4B of the historic Riverside Manor building in downtown Portland, Oregon. At 70 years old, I'd thought I'd found my forever home, a beautiful 2-bedroom unit with original hardwood floors, crown molding from the 1920s, and a spectacular view of the Willamette River that changed with every season. More importantly, it was rent-controlled, making it affordable on my teacher's pension of $2,800 per month. What I didn't know was that the nephew I'd been helping financially for 2 decades had been quietly working to ensure that forever would end the moment I became inconvenient. The apartment had been my sanctuary after my husband Robert died 8 years ago from a sudden heart attack that took him at 67, just 3 years into what should have been our golden retirement years. Robert and I had spent 42 years together, building a modest but comfortable life through his work as a city electrician for Portland General Electric and my 35-year career teaching 4th grade at Beaumont Elementary School. We'd never had children of our own, not by choice, but because life had other plans for us after years of trying and several heartbreaking miscarriages that left us devastated, but ultimately brought us closer together. Instead of the children we'd dreamed of having, we'd poured our love into Robert's sister's boy, Marcus, treating him like the son we'd never had. We'd been there for every birthday, every school play, every baseball game, every milestone that mattered. When Marcus had needed someone to believe in him, we'd been his biggest cheerleaders. When he'd needed financial support, we'd provided it without hesitation. When he'd needed guidance and stability, we'd given him a second home where he was always welcome, always loved, always supported. Marcus Chen was Robert's nephew through his sister Linda, who'd married a brilliant Chinese-American engineer named David Chen in 1975, back when interracial marriages still raised eyebrows in some circles. Linda had been the rebel of the Hartwell family, artistic, independent, and determined to follow her heart regardless of what others thought. David had been completing his master's degree in electrical engineering at Oregon State when they'd met at a coffee shop near campus, and their love story had been the kind that movies are made of. Instant connection, shared dreams, and a commitment to building something beautiful together despite the challenges they knew they'd face. For 15 years, Linda and David had been blissfully happy. David had landed a prestigious position with Intel's growing Portland operations. Linda had established herself as a successful graphic designer, and together they'd built a comfortable middle-class life in a charming house in the Hawthorne district. Marcus had been their miracle baby, born after years of fertility struggles, and he'd been the center of their universe from the moment he'd taken his first breath. But life has a way of shattering even the most perfect stories. When Marcus was 12 years old, Linda had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer that the doctors had caught too late for effective treatment. Despite surgery, chemotherapy, and every experimental treatment they could access, Linda had died within 8 months of her diagnosis, leaving behind a devastated husband and a confused, grieving boy who couldn't understand why his mother had been taken away. David had tried his best to be both father and mother to Marcus, but grief and the demands of his high-pressure job at Intel had made him withdrawn and emotionally unavailable during the years when Marcus had needed stability most. David would work 14-hour days, come home exhausted, and struggle to connect with a son who reminded him of everything he'd lost. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love became quiet and tense, with both father and son trying to navigate their grief without the woman who'd been the heart of their family. That's when Robert and I had stepped in without hesitation. We'd taken Marcus into our lives completely, providing him with the stability and unconditional love he needed during those crucial teenage years. Marcus had essentially lived with us every summer and most weekends throughout high school, and our small house had come alive with the energy of a teenage boy who needed to feel like he belonged somewhere. We'd attended every parent-teacher conference, every school event, every activity that David was too overwhelmed to handle. We'd helped Marcus navigate the social complexities of high school, supported him through his first heartbreak, celebrated his academic achievements, and been there for every moment when he'd needed adult guidance and encouragement. When Marcus had struggled with chemistry during his junior year, I'd found him a tutor and helped him with homework every night until he'd mastered the concepts. When he'd wanted to try out for the debate team but felt intimidated by the other students, Robert had spent hours helping him practice his arguments and build his confidence. When he'd been saving for a car, we'd matched his earnings from his part-time job at the local grocery store, dollar for dollar, until he'd been able to buy his first vehicle. The financial support had started small but had grown substantial over the years. When Marcus had been accepted to Portland State University with a partial academic scholarship, Robert and I had covered the remaining tuition costs, room and board, and living expenses without hesitation. We'd considered it an investment in Marcus's future, a way to honor Linda's memory and ensure that her son would have every opportunity to succeed. During his college years, Marcus had thrived academically and socially. He'd studied business administration with a focus on real estate development, maintained a 3.8 GPA throughout his 4 years, and had been actively involved in student government and the Business Honor Society. We'd been so proud when he'd graduated, summa cum laude, and had immediately been recruited by Premier Properties, one of Portland's most prestigious real estate firms. The graduation ceremony had been one of the happiest days of our lives. Robert and I had sat in the front row, bursting with pride as Marcus had walked across the stage to receive his diploma. David had been there too, finally emerging from his grief enough to recognize what a remarkable young man his son had become. We'd all gone to dinner afterward at Marcus's favorite restaurant, and he'd made a speech thanking us for being the family that had held him together when his world had fallen apart. "Uncle Robert and Aunt Eleanor," he'd said, his voice emotional, as he'd raised his glass, "you saved my life. You gave me a home when I felt lost. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and you loved me like I was your own son. Everything I've accomplished, everything I'll ever accomplish, is because you refused to let me give up on myself." We'd cried that night, happy tears for the young man Marcus had become, and grateful tears for the privilege of having been part of his journey. Robert had talked for weeks about how proud he was, how Linda would have been amazed by the man her little boy had grown up to be, how our investment in Marcus's education and character had been the most meaningful thing we'd ever done with our money. After graduation, Marcus had moved into a small apartment near his job and had begun building his career in real estate with impressive dedication and natural talent. He'd quickly established himself as one of Premier Properties' most promising young agents, specializing in residential sales in Portland's rapidly growing East Side neighborhoods. Within 2 years, he'd been earning 6-figure commissions and had been recognized as the firm's rising star for exceptional sales performance. Throughout this period, Marcus had remained close to us, visiting regularly for family dinners, calling to share news about his work and personal life, and continuing to treat us like the parents he'd chosen rather than the relatives he'd inherited. When Robert had been diagnosed with heart disease at 65, Marcus had been there for every doctor's appointment, every scary moment, every decision about treatment and care. When Robert had died suddenly from a massive heart attack 2 years later, Marcus had been the one to handle all the funeral arrangements while I'd been too devastated to function. He'd organized the service, managed the logistics, dealt with the insurance companies and lawyers, and had been my primary source of support during the most difficult period of my life. "Aunt Eleanor," he'd said as we'd sat in our living room after the funeral, surrounded by flowers and casserole dishes from friends and neighbors, "I want you to know that you'll never have to worry about anything. I'm here for you, just like you and Uncle Robert were always there for me. We're family, and family takes care of each other." I'd believed him completely. Marcus had spent the following months helping me navigate the complicated process of settling Robert's estate, understanding my financial situation, and making decisions about my future. He'd been patient with my grief, supportive during my adjustment to widowhood, and instrumental in helping me understand my options for maintaining financial security on a fixed income. When I'd decided to sell our house and move to a smaller apartment, Marcus had been enthusiastic about helping me find the perfect place. He'd researched neighborhoods, scheduled apartment viewings, and had been the one to find the beautiful rent-controlled unit at Riverside Manor that had become my home for the past 15 years. "This place is perfect for you," he'd said as we'd toured apartment 4B for the first time. "It's in a secure building with an elevator, the rent is affordable, and you'll have that gorgeous river view to enjoy every morning with your coffee. Plus, it's close to the cultural district downtown, so you can walk to the library, the art museum, and all those little cafes you love." Marcus had been right about everything. The apartment had been perfect for my needs, spacious enough for my furniture and belongings, secure enough for me to feel safe living alone, and affordable enough for me to maintain my independence on my teacher's pension. The building itself was a beautifully maintained 1920s structure with original architectural details, reliable utilities, and a small community of long-term residents who looked out for each other. Over the years, Marcus had continued to be an integral part of my life. He'd had his own key to my apartment since the day I'd moved in, was listed as my emergency contact at the hospital and with all my service providers, and was the person I called whenever I needed help with anything, beyond my physical capabilities. When my car had finally died 3 years ago, Marcus had helped me research reliable used vehicles and had negotiated the purchase of the Honda Civic that had served me well ever since. When I'd been overwhelmed by changes to Medicare and supplemental insurance options, Marcus had spent hours researching different plans and had helped me choose coverage that maximized my benefits while minimizing my costs. When I'd been concerned about my long-term financial security, Marcus had connected me with a fee-only financial planner who had helped me organize my assets and create a sustainable budget for my retirement years. At 38 years old, Marcus had become a successful real estate agent with his own growing client base and a reputation for integrity and expertise in Portland's competitive market. He'd purchased his own home in the trendy Alberta Arts District, was in a serious relationship with Sarah Martinez, a physical therapist who worked with elderly patients at Providence Medical Center, and seemed to be building the kind of life that would have made Linda proud. Sarah was lovely, warm, intelligent, and genuinely caring in her interactions with me during the occasional dinners and holiday celebrations we'd shared. She'd grown up in a close-knit Mexican-American family and seemed to understand the importance of extended family relationships. She'd often commented on how lucky Marcus was to have such a supportive aunt and had expressed appreciation for the role I'd played in helping Marcus become the man she'd fallen in love with. "Eleanor," she'd said during last Christmas dinner, "Marcus talks about you and Robert constantly. He credits you with teaching him everything important about love, loyalty, and integrity. You should be so proud of the impact you've had on his life. I had been proud of Marcus's success, proud of the man he'd become, proud of the strong relationship we'd maintained despite the geographical distance between his busy professional life and my quieter retirement routine. Marcus had seemed to embody everything Robert and I had hoped for when we'd taken him into our hearts. He was kind, responsible, successful, and committed to maintaining the family bonds that had sustained him through difficult times. What I hadn't understood was that Marcus had been studying those family bonds very carefully, not to strengthen them, but to identify how they could be leveraged for his own benefit. The first sign that something was wrong should have been Marcus's unusually enthusiastic response when I'd mentioned needing surgery for the herniated disc that had been causing me severe back pain for 8 months. Dr. Patricia Williams, my orthopedic surgeon at OHSU, had explained that the condition had deteriorated to the point where conservative treatment was no longer effective, and that surgical intervention was necessary to prevent permanent nerve damage. The procedure itself is routine, Dr. Williams had explained during our consultation, but recovery will require a 3-week hospital stay for monitoring and initial physical therapy, followed by several weeks of outpatient therapy to rebuild strength and mobility. You'll need someone to check on your apartment and handle any urgent matters while you're away. When I'd shared the surgery details with Marcus during one of our regular Sunday dinners, his response had been immediate and enthusiastic. "Aunt Eleanor, this is exactly what you need," he'd said, leaning forward with apparent concern and excitement. "You've been suffering with this pain for too long, and I can see how it's affecting your quality of life. Don't worry about anything while you're recovering. I'll take complete care of your apartment and make sure everything stays secure." At the time, his offer had seemed like natural family support. Marcus had been helping me with various tasks for years. Everything from changing hard-to-reach light bulbs to reviewing my insurance policies during annual enrollment periods. It had made perfect sense that he would continue that assistance during my recovery period, especially since he had professional experience with property management through his real estate work. What hadn't occurred to me was that 3 weeks of my absence would provide Marcus with the opportunity he'd apparently been waiting for to implement a plan he'd been developing for much longer than I could have imagined. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to certain questions Marcus had been asking over the months leading up to my surgery. Questions about the specific terms of my lease agreement, about my relationship with building management, about my long-term housing plans and financial situation. I'd interpreted these conversations as evidence of Marcus's concern for my future, security, and his desire to help me plan for potential changes in my needs as I aged. "Aunt Eleanor," he'd said during one of these conversations, "have you ever thought about what you'd do if something happened to your health and you couldn't live independently anymore? Do you have plans in place for different scenarios?" I'd appreciated his thoughtfulness and had shared details about my lease terms, my savings account balance, and my general approach to long-term planning. Marcus had listened carefully, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that had seemed motivated by genuine concern for my well-being. "What about your lease?" he'd asked. "Is it transferable if you ever needed to move somewhere with more support, services? And how does rent control work if you're not able to occupy the apartment for extended periods?" I'd explained that my lease included standard provisions for temporary absence due to medical emergencies, and that my rent-controlled status was protected as long as I maintained the apartment as my primary residence. Marcus had nodded thoughtfully and had made comments about wanting to understand these details so he could help me navigate any future challenges. What I now realize is that these conversations had been reconnaissance missions designed to identify vulnerabilities in my housing situation and to understand exactly what legal and financial obstacles Marcus would need to overcome to gain control of my apartment and assets. I should have been suspicious when Marcus had volunteered to handle my mail and manage any urgent correspondence while I was in the hospital. I should have questioned his insistence on being given temporary power of attorney, just in case any important documents need to be signed while you're recovering. I should have wondered why he seemed so knowledgeable about tenant rights, lease transfer procedures, and the specific regulations governing rent-controlled housing in Portland. But I trusted Marcus completely. He was family, the closest thing to a son I'd ever had, someone who'd benefited from my generosity and support for more than 20 years. The possibility that he might be planning to betray that trust in the most devastating way possible had never entered my mind, even for a moment. Marcus had seemed genuinely concerned about my surgery and recovery, visiting me regularly during my preoperative appointments and expressing appropriate anxiety about the risks and potential complications. He'd insisted on driving me to the hospital on the morning of my surgery, had waited during the entire procedure, and had been the first person I'd seen when I'd awakened in the recovery room. "The surgery went perfectly," he'd said, squeezing my hand as I'd struggled to focus. Through the post-anesthetic fog, Dr. Williams said everything looked great, and you're going to feel so much better once you've healed. Don't worry about anything except getting stronger. I've got everything else handled. During my 3 weeks in the hospital, Marcus had visited regularly, bringing flowers, magazines, and updates about my apartment. He'd assured me that everything was fine, that he was collecting my mail, watering my plants, and keeping the place aired out and secure. He'd seemed genuinely concerned about my recovery and enthusiastic about my return home. "The apartment misses you," he'd said during one visit, bringing photos on his phone of my living room with fresh flowers on the coffee table. "But everything's ready for your homecoming. I've been keeping the place in perfect condition, and I can't wait for you to see how good everything looks." What Marcus hadn't mentioned was that perfect condition included the presence of a complete stranger who'd been living in my bedroom while I'd been fighting for my mobility in a hospital bed. The surgery itself had gone exactly as Dr. Williams had predicted. The damaged disc had been successfully repaired, the nerve compression had been relieved, and my recovery had proceeded smoothly through each stage of the healing process. The chronic pain that had been my constant companion for 8 months was finally gone, replaced by the manageable discomfort of surgical healing that would fade with time and physical therapy. Dr. Williams had been pleased with my progress, the nursing staff had commented on my positive attitude and determination, and the physical therapists had been impressed with my commitment to the daily exercises that would restore my strength and mobility. I'd felt stronger and more hopeful than I had in months, ready to reclaim my independence and get back to the life I'd been forced to put on hold. The morning of my discharge had been beautiful. One of those perfect October days in Portland when the autumn light makes everything look like a painting, and the air carries just enough crispness to remind you that change is coming. I'd been excited and optimistic, looking forward to sleeping in my own bed, cooking in my own kitchen, and settling back into the comfortable routines that had been interrupted by months of pain and weeks of hospitalization. Dr. Williams had cleared me for normal activities with some lifting restrictions, and the discharge nurse had given me a folder full of home care instructions, exercise routines, and follow-up appointment schedules. I'd felt like I was finally getting my life back after months of limitation and uncertainty. Marcus had texted that morning saying he was handling some last-minute details to ensure my homecoming would be perfect, and that he'd meet me at the apartment later that afternoon to help me settle in and go over any important matters that had arisen during my absence. I'd appreciated his thoughtfulness and had looked forward to thanking him properly for all his help during my recovery period. The taxi ride from OHSU to Riverside Manor had been pleasant, with the driver helping me navigate with my walker and commenting on what a beautiful day it was for coming home. I'd felt grateful for the sunny weather, for my successful surgery, for the family support that had made my recovery possible, and for the comfortable home waiting for me just 15 minutes away. As we'd pulled up to the familiar brick facade of Riverside Manor, I'd felt a surge of happiness and relief. The building looked exactly as I'd remembered it, stately, secure, and welcoming. The maple trees lining the street were just beginning to turn their autumn colors, and the entire neighborhood had that peaceful, settled feeling that had made me fall in love with the area 15 years earlier. The taxi driver had helped me up the front steps and had waited while I'd used my key to enter the building's main lobby. Everything had looked normal. The same elegant tile floors, the same vintage mailboxes, the same comfortable seating area where residents sometimes gathered to chat. Mrs. Patterson from 2A had been checking her mail and had smiled warmly when she'd seen me. "Eleanor, welcome home, dear," she'd said, approaching carefully when she'd noticed my walker. "How are you feeling? We've all been thinking about you." "Much better, thank you," I'd replied, touched by her concern. "It's so good to be back." "I'm sure it is," Mrs. Patterson had said. "There's nothing like your own home for healing." She'd been right about that, or so I'd thought as I'd made my way slowly to the elevator. My own home, my own space, my own belongings, everything I'd been missing during my weeks in the sterile hospital environment. When I'd reached the 4th floor and approached apartment 4B, I'd been surprised to find that my key didn't work in the lock. I'd tried several times, thinking perhaps the lock was sticking or that my hand coordination was still affected by medication, but the key definitely wasn't engaging properly. The metal had felt wrong somehow, as if the lock mechanism had been changed entirely. That's when building manager Frank Morrison had appeared in the hallway, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that I now recognize was carefully prepared, sympathy mixed with barely concealed discomfort. "Mrs. Hartwell," he'd said, his voice taking on the overly gentle tone people use when they're about to deliver news they know will be devastating. "I'm afraid there's been a change in your housing situation while you were away." And that's when my world had collapsed completely, setting in motion a chain of events that would expose 20 years of careful planning, systematic deception, and a betrayal so complete that it would take me months to understand its full scope. Chakitiyai. Conversation that followed would teach me that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who've been planning your destruction from the very beginning. The discoveries that awaited me would reveal that trust, when misplaced, can be the most dangerous gift you ever give. But what Marcus and his conspirators didn't know was that the helpless old woman they thought they were discarding was actually someone with resources, connections, and a determination they'd seriously underestimated. They were about to learn that stealing from a 70-year-old retired teacher who'd spent 4 decades dealing with manipulative children and entitled parents was the biggest mistake they'd ever made in their lives. Standing in that hallway with Frank Morrison, clutching my discharge papers while he explained that my lease had been legally transferred, I felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare. But to understand how I'd reached this moment of complete betrayal, you need to know about the life I'd built before Marcus destroyed it. A life of careful planning, honest work, and the kind of financial responsibility that had made his treachery possible. My journey to apartment 4B at Riverside Manor had begun 47 years earlier, when I'd graduated from Lewis and Clark College with a degree in elementary education and dreams of making a difference in children's lives. It was 1976, and Portland was still a relatively small city, where teachers could afford to live in decent neighborhoods, and where a woman could build a respectable career without constantly fighting for recognition or equal pay. My first teaching position had been at Beaumont Elementary School in the Northeast Portland neighborhood that was just beginning its transformation from working-class community to the trendy area it would eventually become. The school was housed in a beautiful 1920s brick building with high ceilings, large windows, and the kind of solid construction that suggested education was meant to be permanent and important. I'd been assigned to teach 4th grade, which had turned out to be the perfect grade level for my personality and teaching style. 4th graders were old enough to engage in meaningful conversations and complex projects, but still young enough to be genuinely excited about learning new things. They were at that magical age where they still believed their teacher knew everything, but were beginning to develop their own opinions and critical thinking skills. My starting salary had been $8,200 per year, which sounds impossibly small now, but had been enough to rent a small apartment, buy a reliable used car, and begin building. the foundation of financial independence that would sustain me throughout my career. From that very first paycheck, I'd committed to saving 20% of my income, a habit that had been instilled in me by my Depression-era parents who'd taught me that financial security came from living below your means and preparing for unexpected challenges. Those early years of teaching had been both exhausting and exhilarating. I'd typically arrived at school by 7 a.m. to prepare for the day, stayed until 5 p.m. for lesson planning and grading, and spent most of my weekends creating educational materials or attending workshops to improve my skills. But I'd loved every minute of it. The moment when a struggling student finally grasped a difficult concept, the excitement of a classroom full of children discovering something amazing, the satisfaction of knowing I was helping to shape young minds during their most formative years. I'd also loved the intellectual challenge of constantly adapting my teaching methods to meet the needs of different learning styles and backgrounds. Each year brought a new group of students with unique personalities, strengths, and challenges, requiring me to reinvent my approach while maintaining the core principles of respect, encouragement, and high expectations that had guided my philosophy from the beginning. By my third year of teaching, I'd been recognized as one of the school's most innovative educators, incorporating hands-on science experiments, creative writing projects, and early computer literacy into my curriculum years before these approaches became standard practice. I'd also begun mentoring new teachers, sharing the strategies and techniques I'd developed through trial and error during my first few years in the classroom. It was during my fourth year at Beaumont that I'd met Robert Hartwell, the electrician, who'd been contracted to upgrade the school's aging electrical system during the summer of 1980. Robert had been 32 years old, 3 years older than me, with the kind of quiet competence and gentle humor that had made me feel instantly comfortable in his presence. "You're here early for a teacher on summer vacation," he'd said one morning when he'd arrived to find me setting up my classroom for the upcoming school year. "Don't you believe in taking a break?" "I do," I'd replied, looking up from the bulletin. Board I'd been decorating with student artwork from the previous year. "But I get excited about the new school year. I can't help myself." Robert had smiled at that, a warm expression that had reached his eyes and made me realize how attractive he was when he wasn't concentrating on complex electrical work. "That's one of the things I like about working in schools," he'd said. "Everyone here seems to genuinely care about what they're doing. It's refreshing after working on office buildings where people just seem to be going through the motions." We'd started talking during his lunch breaks, conversations that had quickly progressed from professional pleasantries to personal discussions about our backgrounds, our goals, and our shared values about the importance of honest work and community involvement. Robert had grown up in a working-class family in Southeast Portland, had learned electrical work through an apprenticeship program, and had recently started his own small contracting business specializing in residential and educational facilities. "I like working places where the electricity actually matters to people's daily lives," he'd explained. "When I wire a house, I'm helping a family have a safe, comfortable home. When I work on a school, I'm contributing to children's education. It feels more meaningful than just making rich people's offices more convenient." By the time the school electrical project had been completed in late August, Robert and I had been spending our evenings together, exploring Portland's neighborhoods, trying new restaurants, and discovering that we shared similar dreams about building a life based on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and commitment to our community. Our courtship had been old-fashioned and deliberate, both of us taking the time to really get to know each other before making serious commitments. Robert had met my parents, who'd immediately approved of his work ethic and respectful manner. I'd met his family, including his sister Linda and her husband David, who'd welcomed me warmly and had seemed genuinely pleased that Robert had found someone who appreciated his steady, reliable character. We'd married in June of 1981, a simple ceremony at St. Michael's Church, followed by a reception at the community center, where Robert had volunteered as a youth mentor. The wedding had been everything we'd wanted: meaningful, affordable, and focused on celebrating our commitment with the people who mattered most to us. Our first home had been a modest 1950s ranch house in the Roseway neighborhood, purchased with a combination of our savings and a VA loan that Robert had qualified for through his military service. The house had needed substantial work: updated plumbing, new flooring, modern appliances, and fresh paint throughout. But Robert's skills and my determination to learn home improvement techniques had transformed it into a comfortable, welcoming space. We'd spent our first 2 years of marriage working on the house during weekends and evenings, gradually modernizing each room while maintaining the original character that had attracted us to the property. Robert had handled all the electrical and plumbing upgrades, while I'd focused on painting, decorating, and creating the kind of organized, efficient household that would support both of our careers. During this period, my teaching career had continued to flourish. I'd been promoted to team leader for the 4th grade teachers, had been selected to participate in a pilot program for integrating technology into elementary education, and had received the district's Excellence in Teaching Award for my innovative approaches to helping struggling students succeed academically. My salary had grown steadily, reaching $15,000 by my 6th year of teaching, and I'd continued my practice of saving 20% of every paycheck while contributing to the teachers' retirement system that would eventually provide my pension. Robert's electrical business had also prospered, with steady contracts from residential developers and occasional larger projects with schools and small businesses. By 1983, we'd felt financially secure enough to start trying for children, both of us excited about the prospect of becoming parents and raising a family in the comfortable home we'd created together. We'd had names picked out, had begun converting the spare bedroom into a nursery, and had started the kind of hopeful planning that couples do when they believe their dreams are about to come true. But pregnancy had proved more difficult than we'd anticipated. After a year of trying without success, we'd consulted fertility specialists who'd conducted extensive testing without finding any specific medical explanation for our inability to conceive. We'd tried various treatments and interventions, each month bringing renewed hope followed by devastating disappointment when the results were negative. The miscarriages had been the most heartbreaking part of our fertility journey. 3 times we'd experienced the joy of positive pregnancy tests, followed by the crushing loss of early miscarriages that had left us emotionally devastated and questioning whether we'd ever become parents. Each loss had required time to grieve and recover, both physically and emotionally, before we'd been ready to try again. After 5 years of trying, multiple medical consultations, and 3 miscarriages, Robert and I had finally accepted that biological parenthood might not be part of our story. The grief had been profound, not just for the children we'd lost, but for the family life we'd envisioned and the genetic legacy we'd never pass on. But even in our sadness, we'd found ways to channel our parental instincts into meaningful relationships with the children in our lives. I'd poured even more energy and creativity into my teaching, developing special programs for students who needed extra support and becoming known throughout the district as someone who could reach kids that other teachers had given up on. Robert had begun volunteering with youth programs at our church and the local community center, teaching basic electrical skills to teenagers and serving as a mentor for young men who needed positive male role models. We'd also become the favorite aunt and uncle to Robert's nephew Marcus, treating him like the son we'd never had and making sure he knew he was cherished and supported. The relationship with Marcus had begun when he was just a toddler, but it had deepened significantly after Linda's death when he'd been 12. David's grief and work demands had made it difficult for him to provide the emotional support and stability that Marcus had needed during those crucial adolescent years. So, Robert and I had stepped in without hesitation. "This boy needs us," Robert had said when we'd first discussed how to help David and Marcus navigate their loss. Linda would want us to make sure Marcus has every opportunity to succeed, and right now, that means giving him a stable, loving environment where he can process his grief and continue growing into the man his mother hoped he'd become. Taking Marcus into our lives had felt like the natural thing to do, and it had also filled the void left by our own inability to have children. Marcus had been a bright, sensitive boy who'd responded positively to the structure and encouragement we'd provided. He'd thrived academically under our guidance, had developed confidence in social situations through our support, and had begun to heal from his mother's death through the security of knowing he was unconditionally loved. During his high school years, Marcus had essentially lived with us, maintaining his room at David's house, but spending most of his time in our warm, stable environment. We'd attended every school event, had helped with homework every night, and had been the ones he'd turn to when he'd needed advice about friendships, dating, college planning, and all the other challenges of adolescence. The financial support had started naturally and had grown over time as Marcus's needs had increased. When he'd wanted to participate in debate team but couldn't afford the travel expenses, we'd covered the costs. When he'd needed a computer for school projects, we'd purchased one without hesitation. When he'd been saving for a car, we'd matched his earnings to help him reach his goal more quickly. By the time Marcus had graduated from high school with honors and had been accepted to Portland State University, Robert and I had been spending approximately $8,000 per year on his support, a significant amount considering our combined income. Was around $45,000, but money we'd considered well invested in his future success. The college years had represented our largest financial investment in Marcus's future. Even with his partial academic scholarship, the remaining tuition, room and board, books, and living expenses had totaled nearly $12,000 per year. Robert and I had covered these costs through a combination of our savings and careful budgeting that had required us to postpone some of our own plans, including a long-delayed kitchen renovation and a vacation to Europe we'd been planning for our 10th wedding anniversary. But we'd made these sacrifices gladly, both of us convinced that investing in Marcus's education was the most meaningful way we could honor Linda's memory and ensure that her son would have every opportunity to build a successful, fulfilling life. Marcus had seemed genuinely grateful for our support, often expressing his appreciation and promising that he would find ways to pay back our generosity once he'd established himself professionally. "Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Robert," he'd said during his college graduation speech, "you've given me something more valuable than money. You've given me the confidence to believe in myself and the knowledge that I'm worthy of love and investment. Everything I accomplish in my life will be a reflection of the values you've taught me and the opportunities you've made possible." Those words had meant everything to us, confirmation that our sacrifices had been worthwhile, and that Marcus understood the depth of our commitment to his success. We'd believed that our investment in his education and character would pay dividends not just in his professional achievements, but in his continued presence in our lives as the son we'd chosen, if not born. Throughout this period, my teaching career had continued to provide both personal satisfaction and steady financial growth. By my 15th year at Beaumont Elementary, I'd been earning $28,000 annually and had been promoted to grade-level coordinator, responsible for curriculum development and teacher mentoring across multiple classrooms. I'd also been pursuing continuing education to stay current with new teaching methodologies and educational technologies. I'd completed a master's degree in educational leadership through evening and summer programs, had attended numerous professional development workshops, and had been certified in special education techniques that had made me more effective with students who had learning disabilities or behavioral challenges. The additional qualifications had led to increased responsibilities and salary increases, but more importantly, they'd enhanced my effectiveness as an educator and had given me the tools to help an even wider range of students succeed. By the 1990s, I'd been recognized as one of the district's master teachers, frequently asked to mentor new educators and to participate in curriculum committees that shaped educational policy. Robert's electrical business had also grown substantially during this period. He'd built a reputation for quality work and fair pricing that had led to steady referrals and repeat customers. By the late 1980s, He'd been employing 2 full-time apprentices and had established contracts with several residential developers who'd relied on his expertise for new construction projects. Our combined income had reached $65,000 by the early 1990s, making us solidly middle class and allowing us to accelerate our savings rate while maintaining a comfortable lifestyle. We'd paid off our mortgage early, had maximized our contributions to retirement accounts, and had built a substantial emergency fund that had provided financial security and peace of mind. The house in Roseway had appreciated significantly during Portland's economic growth of the 1990s, and we'd used some of the equity to make improvements that had both enhanced our quality of life and increased the property's value. We'd added a beautiful deck overlooking our garden, had updated the kitchen with modern appliances and granite countertops, and had finished the basement to create a comfortable guest room for Marcus during his college visits. Life had felt stable and fulfilling during those years. We'd had meaningful work that had provided both income and satisfaction, a comfortable home that had reflected our values and taste, strong relationships with family and friends, and the financial security that had come from decades of careful planning and responsible spending. Marcus had remained an important part of our lives throughout his college years and early career, visiting regularly for family dinners and holiday celebrations. We'd been proud of his academic achievements, excited about his early success in real estate, and pleased with the respectful, responsible young man he'd become. When Robert had been diagnosed with heart disease at 65, Marcus had been incredibly supportive, accompanying us to doctor's appointments and helping us understand treatment options and lifestyle modifications. He'd seemed genuinely concerned about Robert's health and had made efforts to spend more time with us, apparently recognizing that our time together might be limited. "Uncle Robert has been like a father to me," Marcus had said during one of our conversations about Robert's condition. "I want to make sure I'm doing everything possible to support both of you during this challenging time. You've always been there for me, and now it's my turn to be there for you." His support had meant everything to us during those difficult months, when Robert's health had been declining and we'd been facing the reality that our retirement years might be shorter than we'd planned. Marcus had helped with household tasks that had become difficult for Robert, had researched treatment options and support services, and had provided the emotional support that had helped us maintain hope and optimism despite the uncertainty. When Robert had died suddenly from a massive heart attack in 2015, Marcus had been the one to handle all the practical arrangements while I'd been too devastated to function. He'd organized the funeral service, had managed communications with family and friends, had dealt with insurance companies and lawyers, and had been my primary source of support during the most difficult period of my life. The grief had been overwhelming. Not just the loss of my husband and best friend, but the sudden transformation from being part of a couple to being alone for the first time in my adult life. Everything about my daily routine had required adjustment, from cooking meals for one person to making decisions without Robert's input and perspective. Marcus had been patient and understanding during my adjustment period, visiting regularly to check on my well-being and helping me navigate the practical challenges of widowhood. He'd helped me understand my financial situation, had assisted with paperwork and legal matters, and had been instrumental in helping me make decisions about my future. "Aunt Eleanor," he'd said several months after Robert's funeral, "I know this. Transition has been incredibly difficult, but I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm here to help with whatever you need, and I want to make sure you feel secure and supported as you figure out this next phase of your life." The decision to sell our house and move to a smaller apartment had been practical and emotional. The house had held too many memories of the life Robert and I had shared, and maintaining the property had become more challenging without his help with repairs and yard work. The equity from the sale had provided financial security for my retirement years, and the rent-controlled apartment at Riverside Manor had offered the perfect combination of affordability, security, and location. Marcus had been enthusiastic about helping me find the right place, researching neighborhoods and apartment buildings, scheduling viewings, and providing guidance about the practical considerations of apartment living. When we'd found apartment 4B at Riverside Manor, he'd been as excited as I'd been about the beautiful space and the opportunities it would provide for the next phase of my life. "This place is perfect for you," he'd said as we'd toured the apartment with its original hardwood floors, large windows, and spectacular river view. "You'll be comfortable here, and you'll have access to all the cultural activities downtown that you love so much. This feels like home already." He'd been right about that. The apartment had quickly become my sanctuary, a place where I could maintain my independence while feeling secure and connected to the community I'd chosen. The building's other residents had been welcoming and friendly. The location had provided easy access to libraries, museums, and restaurants. And the affordable rent had allowed me to maintain my financial security on my teacher's pension. For 15 years, apartment 4B had been more than just housing. It had been my refuge, my center, my carefully chosen environment for aging with dignity and independence. I decorated it with furniture and artwork that reflected my personality and history, had established routines that had provided structure and meaning to my days, and had built relationships with neighbors that had given me a sense of community and belonging. The apartment had represented everything I'd worked for during my decades of teaching and careful financial planning: security, comfort, independence, and the freedom to live according to my own values and preferences. It had been the foundation for the retirement I'd earned through decades of service to my community and responsible management of my resources. And now, standing in the hallway outside apartment 4B, with my discharge papers in my hand, and Frank Morrison explaining that my lease had been legally transferred, I was beginning to understand that everything I'd built, everything I'd planned for, everything I'd believed was secure had been systematically stolen by the person I'd trusted most in the world. The nephew I'd raised like a son, the young man I'd invested my life savings in, the family member I'd trusted with keys to my home and access to my financial information, had used that trust to destroy everything I'd spent 70 years building. But what Marcus didn't understand was that stealing from someone who'd spent 4 decades teaching children had given me insights into manipulative behavior that he'd seriously underestimated. What he hadn't anticipated was that the teacher who'd dealt with entitled parents and dishonest students had developed skills for identifying deception and enforcing consequences that would soon become his worst nightmare. The conversation with Frank Morrison was about to reveal the full scope of Marcus's betrayal, but it was also about to set in motion a response that would demonstrate exactly why underestimating a retired educator with nothing left to lose was the biggest mistake Marcus would ever make in his life. The foundation I'd built through decades of honest work and careful planning was about to become the platform from which I would launch a counterattack that would expose every detail of Marcus's conspiracy and ensure that justice was served in ways he could never have imagined. Sometimes the people who think you're powerless have forgotten that real power comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Marcus was about to get a very expensive education in that reality. Standing in that hallway listening to Frank Morrison explain how my nephew had legally transferred my lease while I was recovering from surgery, I couldn't help but remember how different things had been just 5 years ago, when Marcus and I had celebrated what I'd thought was the pinnacle of our relationship: his engagement to Sarah and the promise of the family expansion I'd dreamed of since Robert's death. It was Christmas Eve 2018, and apartment 4B had been transformed into the kind of warm, welcoming space that embodied everything I'd hoped for in my retirement years. The living room glowed with soft light from the vintage lamps I'd collected over the years. The dining table was set with my grandmother's china for the intimate dinner I'd prepared for Marcus, Sarah, and David, and the tree in the corner sparkled with ornaments that told the story of our family's history together. I'd spent days preparing for this celebration, wanting everything to be perfect for what had become our most important family tradition. The menu featured Marcus's favorite dishes: herb-crusted prime rib, my signature garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole made from Robert's mother's recipe, and the chocolate bourbon pecan pie that Marcus had been requesting every Christmas. Since he was 16 years old, the apartment had never looked more beautiful. I'd decorated every room with fresh evergreen garlands, had arranged white poinsettias throughout the living spaces, and had created a centerpiece for the dining table using candles, pine cones, and silver ribbons that caught the light from the chandelier Robert had helped me install years earlier. "Aunt Eleanor, this place looks absolutely magical," Sarah had said as she'd arrived carrying a bottle of wine and a beautifully wrapped gift. "You've outdone yourself this year. Everything is so elegant and festive." Sarah had looked radiant that evening, wearing a deep red dress that complemented her dark hair and olive complexion, and carrying herself with the kind of quiet confidence that had made me understand why Marcus had fallen so deeply in love with her. At 35, she was an accomplished physical therapist who specialized in geriatric rehabilitation, and her work with elderly patients had given her insights into aging and family dynamics that had made our conversations increasingly meaningful over the 3 years she'd been part of our lives. "Thank you, sweetheart," I'd replied, embracing her warmly. "I love having reasons to make this place special for the people I care about most." Marcus had arrived moments later with David, both men looking handsome in their dress shirts and ties, carrying gifts and wearing the kind of relaxed, happy expressions that suggested they were genuinely looking forward to our evening together. Marcus had seemed particularly excited about something, his eyes bright with anticipation, and his manner slightly more animated than usual. "Merry Christmas, Aunt Eleanor," he'd said, hugging me tightly and holding on for just a moment longer than usual. "I hope you're ready for a very special evening. We have something important to share with everyone." The dinner had been everything I'd hoped it would be. Delicious food, engaging conversation, and the kind of warm family atmosphere that had made me feel grateful for the relationships that had sustained me through the challenges of aging and widowhood. David had seemed more relaxed and happy than I'd seen him in years, finally emerging from the grief that had defined his personality since Linda's death. "Eleanor," David had said as we'd enjoyed our main course, "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for Marcus over the years. Watching him become the man he is today, seeing him find love with Sarah, knowing that he has the values and character to build a strong family. So much of that is because of the foundation you and Robert provided." His words had meant everything. To me, validation that our investment in Marcus's future had been worthwhile, and that the sacrifices we'd made had contributed to something meaningful and lasting. I'd felt a deep sense of satisfaction and peace, knowing that the young man we'd helped raise had grown into someone worthy of our love and support. "Marcus has always been special," I'd replied, looking at him with pride. "Robert and I just provided love and encouragement. Everything Marcus has accomplished is a reflection of his own character and determination." Marcus had smiled at that, his expression warm and affectionate, and had reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Aunt Eleanor, you've been so much more than love and encouragement," he'd said. "You've been my anchor, my guide, my source of wisdom and strength. Everything good in my life can be traced back to the security and values you and Uncle Robert gave me when I needed them most." As we'd moved to the living room for dessert and gift exchange, Marcus had seemed increasingly excited about whatever announcement he was planning to make. He'd been exchanging glances with Sarah, both of them barely containing their enthusiasm about something they were clearly eager to share. "Before we open gifts," Marcus had said, standing up and taking Sarah's hand, "Sarah and I have something we want to tell you." I'd felt my heart begin to race with anticipation, hoping for the news I'd been quietly expecting and eagerly awaiting for months. Marcus and Sarah had been together for 3 years, were clearly devoted to each other, and had been dropping hints about their future plans that had suggested an engagement was imminent. "We're engaged," Sarah had announced, her face glowing with happiness as she'd held up her left hand to display a beautiful vintage-style engagement ring with a classic solitaire diamond setting. The joy I'd felt in that moment had been overwhelming. Pure happiness for Marcus and Sarah, excitement about the wedding planning that lay ahead, and deep satisfaction that our family was expanding in exactly the way I'd hoped it would. I'd jumped up from my chair, probably faster than was wise for a 70-year-old woman, and had embraced them both with tears of joy streaming down my face. "Oh, this is wonderful," I'd exclaimed. "I'm so happy for both of you. Sarah, welcome to the family officially, though you've felt like family to me for a long time already." David had been equally thrilled, hugging his son and future daughter-in-law with obvious pride and excitement. For a few minutes, the living room had been filled with congratulations, questions about the proposal, and animated discussion about wedding plans and timeline. "We were thinking about a fall wedding next year," Marcus had explained. "Something elegant but not too large, maybe at the Portland Art Museum or one of the historic venues downtown. We want it to feel meaningful and beautiful, but we also want to make sure the important people in our lives can be there to celebrate with us. I hope you'll let me help with the planning," I'd said, already imagining the joy of being involved in creating the perfect celebration for this young couple I loved so much. "I'd be honored to contribute whatever you need, whether that's financial support, planning assistance, or just an extra pair of hands." "Aunt Eleanor," Sarah had said, her eyes bright with affection. "We were actually hoping you'd be my matron of honor. I know that's usually a role for a sister or best friend, but you've become such an important part of my life, and I can't imagine walking down the aisle without you beside me." The invitation had been unexpected and deeply touching. Being asked to serve as matron of honor had felt like official recognition of my place in their lives, confirmation that I wasn't just Marcus's honorary aunt, but an integral part of the family they were building together. "I would be absolutely delighted," I'd replied, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for thinking of me. This means more than you can possibly know." The rest of the evening had been spent discussing wedding plans, looking at photos of potential venues on Marcus's phone, and talking about guest lists, catering options, and all the details that would need to be coordinated over the following months. I'd felt more energized and excited than I had since Robert's death, thrilled to have a major family celebration to look forward to and a meaningful role to play in making it special. The gift exchange had been particularly meaningful that year. I'd given Marcus and Sarah a substantial check to help with wedding expenses, along with a family heirloom, my grandmother's pearl necklace that had been worn by 3 generations of brides in our family. Sarah had been visibly moved by the gesture, understanding the significance of being offered such a treasured family piece. "Eleanor, I'm honored that you want me to wear this," she'd said, holding the pearls carefully. "I promise to take good care of them and to pass them on to the next generation when the time comes." Marcus and Sarah had given me a beautiful photo album they'd created, filled with pictures from our family gatherings over the past 3 years, along with written memories and reflections about what our relationship had meant to them. The album had been a work of art and love, demonstrating the thought and care they'd put into acknowledging my importance in their lives. "We wanted you to have something that captures all the wonderful times we've shared," Marcus had explained. "You've made such a difference in both our lives, and we wanted you to know how grateful we are for your love and support." That Christmas Eve had felt like the culmination of everything Robert and I had hoped for when we'd first taken Marcus into our hearts. He'd grown into a successful, caring man who'd found love with an exceptional woman, and they were building the kind of family that honored the values we'd tried to instill. The wedding planning process had been one of the most joyful experiences of my retirement years. Sarah had involved me in every decision, from choosing the venue to selecting flowers, from tasting menu options to deciding on invitation designs. We'd spent countless Saturday afternoons visiting bridal shops, florists, and caterers, developing the kind of close relationship that I'd always hoped to have with a daughter-in-law. "Eleanor, what do you think about this color scheme?" Sarah would ask, showing me fabric samples or flower arrangements. "I value your opinion so much. You have such excellent taste, and I want everything to be perfect." Her deference to my opinions had felt genuine rather than obligatory, and I'd appreciated being treated as a valuable contributor rather than a peripheral family member whose input was politely tolerated. Sarah had seemed to genuinely enjoy our planning sessions, often commenting on how much she was learning from my experience with event planning and household management. The venue selection had been particularly meaningful. After touring several possibilities, we'd fallen in love with the historic Overlook House, a beautifully restored 1920s mansion with gardens overlooking the Columbia River. The setting had been perfect for the elegant but intimate celebration Marcus and Sarah had envisioned, with space for 120 guests and the kind of architectural details that would make every photograph timeless and beautiful. "This feels right," Sarah had said as we'd toured the grounds for the second time. "It's sophisticated but not pretentious, beautiful but not overwhelming." I can picture Marcus and me saying our vows here. I'd offered to pay for the venue rental, a $8,000 expense that had represented a significant portion of my discretionary spending for the year, but money I'd been happy to contribute to making their dream wedding possible. Marcus and Sarah had initially protested, insisting they could handle the expenses themselves, but I'd convinced them to accept my contribution as my wedding gift to them. "Please let me do this," I'd said. "Robert and I always plan to help with Marcus's wedding expenses, and I know he would want me to make sure this celebration is everything you've dreamed of." The months leading up to the wedding had been filled with regular dinners at my apartment, where we'd go over planning details while enjoying home-cooked meals that had become some of my favorite times of the week. Marcus and Sarah had established a routine of visiting every Sunday evening, bringing wine and dessert while I prepared the main course, and we'd spend hours talking about everything from wedding logistics to their future plans for home ownership and starting a family. "We're thinking about looking for a house in the Hawthorne area," Marcus had shared during one of these dinners. "Something with character and potential, maybe a 1920s bungalow we could restore over time. Sarah loves the neighborhood, and it would put us close enough to visit you regularly but far enough away that we'd have our own space." The idea of them settling in Portland permanently had thrilled me, guaranteeing that I'd remain an important part of their lives and that any future children would grow up knowing their honorary grandmother. I'd even offered to help with their down payment when the time came, wanting to ensure they could afford a home in the neighborhood they preferred. "I'd be happy to help with your house purchase," I'd said. "Consider it an investment in keeping my family close by." The wedding day itself had been absolutely perfect. Sunny October weather, the venue decorated with fall flowers in shades of gold and burgundy, and Sarah looking radiant in a classic A-line gown that had complemented the pearls she'd worn in honor of our family tradition. My role as matron of honor had been one of the proudest moments of my life, standing beside Sarah as she'd promised to love and honor the young man Robert and I had raised. Marcus had been emotional during the ceremony, tears streaming down his face as Sarah had spoken her vows, and I'd been struck by the depth of love and commitment both of them had expressed. The officiating minister had spoken about the importance of family support in building strong marriages, and had specifically acknowledged the role that extended family and chosen family play in providing foundation and guidance for young couples. Marcus and Sarah are blessed to have family members like David and Eleanor, who have provided love, wisdom, and support throughout their journey to this moment, the minister had said. Their marriage will be strengthened by the examples of commitment and devotion they've witnessed in their own family relationships. The reception had been equally beautiful, with heartfelt toasts from David and myself, delicious food that reflected both Marcus and Sarah's tastes, and dancing that had continued until well into the evening. I'd danced with Marcus during the traditional mother-son dance, a moment that had felt like official recognition of the maternal role I'd played in his life. "Thank you for everything, Aunt Eleanor," he'd whispered as we'd swayed to the music. "This day wouldn't have been possible without your love and support. I hope you know how much you mean to both Sarah and me." "I love you like my own son," I replied, meaning every word. "I'm so proud of the man you've become, and so excited about the life you and Sarah are building together. The first 2 years of their marriage had been everything I'd hoped they would be. Regular family dinners, holiday celebrations at my apartment, and the kind of close, warm relationship that had made me feel like an integral part of their lives, rather than an obligation they needed to manage. Sarah had continued to seek my advice about everything from career decisions to home decorating, and I'd felt valued and needed in ways that had given meaning and purpose to my retirement years. When they'd found their perfect house in Hawthorne, a 1924 bungalow with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that needed complete renovation, I'd been thrilled to contribute $25,000 toward their down payment. "Eleanor, this is too generous," Sarah had protested when I'd presented them with the check. "We can't accept this much money." "Please don't refuse this gift," I'd replied. "Robert and I always planned to help Marcus with his first home purchase, and I want you both to have the security and stability that come with home ownership. Consider it an investment in your future and my insurance policy for regular family dinners." They'd eventually accepted the contribution with gratitude and had invited me to be intimately involved in their renovation plans. I'd spent countless weekends at their house, helping Sarah choose paint colors and fixtures, offering advice about space planning and storage solutions, and enjoying the satisfaction of contributing to their happiness and comfort. The house had been transformed over 18 months into exactly the kind of warm, welcoming home that reflected their personalities and values. The kitchen renovation had been particularly successful, with white cabinets, granite countertops, and stainless steel appliances that had created the perfect space for the kind of entertaining Marcus and Sarah had enjoyed. "This kitchen is my dream come true," Sarah had said during the renovation completion celebration dinner. "I love that it's big enough for all of us to cook together when you come over for Sunday dinners." Those Sunday dinners had become the highlight of my week. Regular gatherings where we'd prepare meals together, catch up on work and social activities, and maintain the kind of close family bonds that had made my retirement years feel full and meaningful. Marcus and Sarah had seemed genuinely to enjoy spending time with me, often staying until late in the evening and reluctant to leave when work obligations required early bedtimes. The second Christmas after their wedding had been particularly special, celebrated at their newly renovated house with David and myself as guests in their beautiful new space. Sarah had prepared an elaborate dinner, Marcus had installed a magnificent tree in their living room, and the entire evening had felt like evidence that our family was thriving and would continue to provide mutual support and joy for years to come. "I love having everyone here," Sarah had said as we'd gathered around their dining room table. "This feels like the beginning of a new family tradition. I hope we'll be celebrating holidays in this house for decades to come." Marcus had seemed equally content that evening, relaxed and happy in his role as host, clearly proud of the home he and Sarah had created and pleased to be sharing it with the family members who mattered most to him. He'd made a toast that night that had seemed to summarize everything positive about our relationship and his gratitude for the foundation Robert and I had provided. "To family," he'd said, raising his wine glass. "To the people who loved me when I needed it most, who supported my dreams, and who continue to be my source of strength and guidance. Aunt Eleanor, Dad, I'm grateful every day for the examples you've set and the love you've shown. Sarah and I are committed to building the kind of family relationships that honor what you've taught us about loyalty, generosity, and unconditional love." During this golden period, Marcus had also been thriving professionally. His real estate career had reached new heights, with annual earnings exceeding $150,000 and recognition as one of Premier Property's top-performing agents. He'd been featured in Portland Business Journal as one of the city's 40 under 40 rising professionals and had been invited to speak at industry conferences about innovative marketing strategies and client relationship management. "I'm so proud of your success," I'd told him during one of our regular phone conversations. "You're building exactly the kind of career that Robert and I always hoped you'd have. Meaningful work that uses your talents and provides financial security for your family. I couldn't have done it without the foundation you and Uncle Robert provided," he'd replied. "The work ethic, the integrity, the commitment to excellence. Those values have been the key to everything I've accomplished. Sarah's career had also flourished during this period. She'd been promoted to supervisor of geriatric physical therapy at Providence Medical Center, had begun teaching courses at the community college, and had been developing a private practice, specializing in home-based therapy for elderly patients. Her work had given her insights into aging and family dynamics that had made our conversations increasingly rich and meaningful. "Eleanor, working with elderly patients has made me appreciate what you and Marcus have even more," she'd said during one of our planning sessions for their home renovation. "So many of my patients are isolated from their families, and I see how much that affects their mental and physical health. The relationship you have with Marcus is something special, and I hope we can maintain that closeness as we all get older." Her comment had touched me deeply, confirmation that she understood and valued the family bonds that had sustained us through difficult times. I'd felt optimistic about the future, confident that Marcus and Sarah would provide the kind of support and companionship that would make my later years meaningful and secure. The financial planning conversations during this period had reinforced my confidence in our family relationships. Marcus had continued to update me on his growing success, his increasing income, and his plans for long-term financial security. He'd seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being and had regularly asked about my finances, my healthcare needs, and my plans for maintaining independence as I aged. "Aunt Eleanor, I want you to know that Sarah and I are committed to making sure you never have to worry about anything," he'd said during one of these conversations. "We're in a position now where we can provide support if you ever need it, and we want you to feel completely secure about your future." His reassurances had meant everything to me, evidence that the investment Robert and I had made in his education and character was continuing to pay dividends in terms of family loyalty and mutual support. I'd felt confident that whatever challenges aging might bring, I would face them with the love and assistance of a family that valued me as much as I valued them. The apartment at Riverside Manor had never felt more like home than it did during this golden period. Marcus and Sarah had helped me with several improvement projects: new carpet in the bedroom, updated lighting fixtures throughout, and a beautiful new sound system that had enhanced my enjoyment of the classical music that filled my quiet evenings. "This place looks amazing," Marcus had said after we'd completed the lighting project. "You've created such a beautiful, comfortable environment here. I love that you're surrounded by things that make you happy." The building's other residents had also become an important part of my social life during this period. Mrs. Patterson, from 2A, and I had developed a close friendship based on our shared love of reading and gardening. Mr. and Mrs. Chen from 3C had become regular companions for evening walks along the river. The building's monthly potluck dinners had provided opportunities for meaningful social connections with people who shared similar interests and values. "You've really found your place here," Sarah had observed during one of her visits. "I love seeing how connected you are to this community. It makes me feel confident that you're thriving in this environment." Everything about my life during this golden period had felt sustainable and fulfilling. I'd had financial security, meaningful family relationships, engaging social connections, and the kind of comfortable independence that had made aging feel like a privilege rather than a burden. I'd looked forward to years of continued family celebrations, watching Marcus and Sarah's career success, and hopefully welcoming grandchildren who would add new dimensions to our family relationships. The last truly perfect family gathering had been Marcus's 36th birthday celebration in March 2021, just 6 months before everything would begin to change in ways I could never have anticipated. We'd celebrated at their house with a dinner party that had included David, myself, and several of Marcus and Sarah's closest friends. Marcus had seemed completely content that evening, successful in his career, happy in his marriage, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him, and looking forward to the future with optimism and confidence. He'd made a speech that night thanking everyone for their friendship and support, with special recognition of the role I'd played in his life. "Aunt Eleanor," he'd said, You've been my constant source of love and guidance for more than 20 years. Everything good in my life can be traced back to the values you and Uncle Robert taught me and the opportunities you made possible. I'm grateful every day for your presence in my life." Those words had represented the pinnacle of our relationship. Acknowledgement, gratitude, and mutual affection that had seemed to guarantee a future of continued closeness and family harmony. I'd gone home that night feeling deeply satisfied with the life I'd built and the relationships that would sustain me through whatever challenges lay ahead. But what I hadn't understood was that Marcus's expressions of gratitude and commitment had already begun to ring hollow, that his concerns about my well-being had transformed into calculations about my vulnerabilities, and that his promises of future support had become strategies for gaining access to my assets. The golden era of our relationship was ending, though. I wouldn't recognize the signs until it was far too late to protect myself from the betrayal that was already in motion. Standing in that hallway outside apartment 4B, listening to Frank Morrison explain that my lease had been legally transferred while I was recovering from surgery, I finally understood that everything I'd believed about Marcus's character and our family bond had been an elaborate performance, designed to position him for the ultimate theft. The young man who'd toasted family loyalty and unconditional love had been planning my destruction even as he'd spoken those words. The nephew who'd promised to ensure I'd never have to worry about anything had been systematically creating the conditions that would leave me homeless and helpless. But what Marcus had failed to understand was that the same person who'd built a successful career, maintained financial security, and navigated complex family relationships for 7 decades wasn't going to be destroyed without a fight that would expose every detail of his betrayal and ensure that justice was served in ways he'd never anticipated. The golden era was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Standing in that hallway with Frank Morrison, listening to him explain that my lease had been legally transferred while I was recovering from surgery, I felt the last fragments of my old life crumbling away. But what Frank said next would transform my shock and devastation into a cold, calculating fury that would change everything. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand this is difficult," Frank continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone people use when they think they're dealing with a confused, elderly person. "But your nephew provided all the proper documentation. He had power of attorney, medical certification of your incapacity, and a legitimate buyer ready to assume the lease. Everything was processed according to legal requirements." Medical certification of my incapacity. Marcus had somehow convinced a doctor to declare me mentally incompetent while I was recovering from a routine back surgery. "What medical certification?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I was recovering from disc surgery, not suffering from dementia or mental illness." Frank shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping I would accept his explanation, without requiring detailed justification. "The documentation indicated cognitive decline and inability to manage your affairs independently," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "Your nephew was very concerned about your welfare and felt that transitioning you to an appropriate care facility was in your best interest." Appropriate care facility. Marcus had used the same strategy that families employ to warehouse elderly, relatives they find inconvenient, except he'd implemented it while I was physically unable to defend myself. "I want to see this documentation," I said firmly. "I want copies of every paper Marcus filed, every signature, every medical opinion used to justify this theft." "Mrs. Hartwell," Frank said, his tone becoming slightly defensive, "I'm not sure. Theft is the appropriate term. This was a legal transfer conducted with proper authorization." "Frank," I interrupted, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd perfected during 35 years of dealing with difficult parents and administrators. "I am 70 years old, not dead. I am recovering from back surgery, not suffering from Alzheimer's disease. I have been declared competent by every medical professional involved in my care, and I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. I pulled out my discharge papers and handed them to Frank. These documents, signed yesterday by Dr. Patricia Williams at OHSU, clearly state that I am mentally competent, physically capable of independent living, and cleared for normal activities, I continued. Whatever Marcus filed to convince you I was incapacitated was fraudulent, and you've participated in the theft of my home based on false information. Frank examined my discharge papers, his expression shifting from patronizing confidence to genuine concern as he realized the legal implications of what had occurred. Mrs. Hartwell, he said slowly, if these documents are accurate, then there may have been some misrepresentation in the paperwork your nephew provided. There wasn't misrepresentation, Frank, I replied coldly. There was fraud, and you're going to help me understand exactly how extensive this fraud was, or you're going to find yourself explaining to investigators why you participated in the illegal eviction of a competent tenant based on forged medical documents. Frank's face had gone pale as he began to understand that he might have legal liability for his role in the scheme. Let me get the file, he said quickly. I think we need to review all the documentation more carefully. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Frank's office reviewing a stack of papers that revealed the full scope of Marcus's betrayal. The documents were sophisticated, professional, and absolutely devastating in their implications. The medical certification had been signed by Dr. James Richardson, a physician I'd never heard of, claiming that I was suffering from progressive cognitive decline with impaired judgment and decision-making capacity. The evaluation was dated 3 days after my surgery, while I was still in the hospital under sedation, and claimed to be based on extensive neurological testing and behavioral observation. The power of attorney document was equally fraudulent. While I had signed a limited medical power of attorney giving Marcus authority to make healthcare decisions if I became unconscious during surgery, the document Frank had on file was an expanded version claiming to grant Marcus comprehensive authority over all my financial and legal affairs. Most disturbing of all was the lease transfer agreement, which showed that Marcus had sold my rent-controlled apartment to someone named Jessica Torres for $85,000. Money that had apparently gone directly into Marcus's personal account, rather than being held in trust for my benefit. Frank, I said, my voice deadly calm, do you understand what you've shown me? Mrs. Hartwell, I'm beginning to realize that there may have been some irregularities. There weren't irregularities, I interrupted. There were felonies, multiple felonies, fraud, theft, elder abuse, forgery, and conspiracy, and you've provided me with documented evidence of every single crime. I gathered up the papers and stood up from my chair. I need copies of every document in this file, I said, and I need them now, before anyone has an opportunity to make these papers disappear. Frank was clearly panicking as he realized his potential legal exposure. Of course, he said quickly. I'll have copies made immediately. Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to know that I had no idea there was anything improper about these documents. Your nephew was very convincing and everything appeared to be legitimate. Frank, I said, stopping him before he could continue with excuses that would only make his situation worse. You're going to help me fix this situation, and you're going to do it quickly and completely. Because if you don't, you're going to find yourself explaining to federal investigators why you participated in a conspiracy to defraud an elderly woman out of her home. While Frank was making copies of the fraudulent documents, I used his phone to make the first of the calls that would begin unraveling Marcus's carefully constructed scheme. The first call was to Dr. Patricia Williams' office, where I spoke directly with her nurse about the fraudulent medical certification. Mrs. Hartwell, the nurse said after I'd explained the situation, Dr. Williams never referred you to any Dr. Richardson, and your discharge notes clearly state that you showed no signs of cognitive impairment throughout your entire stay. What you're describing sounds like medical fraud, and Dr. Williams will want to report this to the appropriate authorities immediately. The second call was to my bank, where I discovered that Marcus had attempted to access my accounts using the fraudulent power of attorney, but had been blocked by security procedures I'd established years earlier, requiring in-person verification for any major account changes. "Mrs. Hartwell," the bank manager explained, "your nephew did present documentation claiming authority over your accounts, but our security protocols flagged the request for additional verification. When we couldn't reach you for confirmation, we placed a hold on any account modifications pending direct contact with you. Marcus's scheme had been sophisticated, but he'd underestimated the security measures I'd put in place to protect my assets. More importantly, he'd underestimated my capacity to fight back when cornered." The third call was to Portland Police, where I was transferred to Detective Maria Santos in the Economic Crimes Unit. "Mrs. Hartwell," Detective Santos said after I'd explained the situation, "what you're describing appears to be a complex case of elder financial abuse with multiple criminal violations. I'm going to need you to come to the station this afternoon to provide a formal statement and turn over the evidence you've gathered." "Detective Santos," I replied, "I'll be there within the hour. And I think you should know that this case involves a real estate agent who may have used his professional credentials to facilitate fraud. This might be bigger than just one family's personal dispute." By 2 p.m. that afternoon, I was sitting in Detective Santos's office providing a detailed statement about Marcus's betrayal, while she examined the fraudulent documents Frank had provided. Detective Santos was an experienced investigator who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims, and she immediately recognized the sophistication of Marcus's scheme. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "this is one of the most elaborate elder abuse cases I've encountered. Your nephew didn't just steal your apartment. He created an entire framework for systematically looting your assets while making it appear legal and medically justified." She pulled out a folder containing similar cases she'd investigated. "The pattern is always the same," she continued. "A trusted family member gains access to financial information and legal documents, then uses a medical crisis to implement fraudulent powers of attorney and asset transfers. What makes your case unusual is the level of documentation and the professional credentials your nephew used to legitimize the fraud." Detective Santos explained that Marcus's real estate license had given him access to legal resources and professionals, networks that had made his scheme more sophisticated than typical family theft cases. "He used his professional knowledge to create documents that would pass casual inspection," she said. "The fake medical certification, the altered power of attorney, the lease transfer agreement. These weren't amateur forgeries. He had help from people who understood legal requirements and documentation standards." Over the following week, Detective Santos's investigation began unraveling the full scope of Marcus's conspiracy. The fraudulent Dr. Richardson turned out to be Marcus's college roommate, James Richardson, who worked as a nurse practitioner but had no authority to declare anyone mentally incompetent. The lease transfer to Jessica Torres revealed that she was Sarah's cousin, who had agreed to temporarily occupy my apartment while Marcus figured out how to liquidate my belongings and maximize the financial benefit of his theft. But the most shocking discovery came when Detective Santos traced Marcus's financial records and found evidence that he'd been planning this betrayal for more than 2 years. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said during our follow-up meeting, "your nephew has been systematically documenting your daily routines, your financial resources, your medical appointments, and your social connections since early 2021. He created detailed files about your vulnerabilities and assets that read like a professional theft manual." She showed me printed copies of Marcus's computer files, including spreadsheets detailing my income, savings account balances, and the estimated value of my personal belongings. There were also notes about my medical conditions, my reliance on him for various types of assistance, and his assessment of my diminished capacity for self-advocacy. Most devastating of all were the email communications between Marcus and Sarah, discussing their plans for my transition to appropriate care and their strategies for gaining control of my assets for her own protection. "The apartment was just the beginning," Detective Santos explained. "They were planning to have you declared incompetent, move you to a care facility, and systematically liquidate all your assets over the following year. Your surgery provided the perfect opportunity to implement the first phase of their plan. The evidence was overwhelming, and the criminal charges were filed within 10 days of my initial police report. Marcus was arrested at his office on charges of elder abuse, fraud, theft, conspiracy, and forgery. Sarah was charged as a co-conspirator, and James Richardson was charged with medical fraud and conspiracy. But criminal charges were only the beginning of my response to Marcus's betrayal. While the police investigation was proceeding, I was working with my attorney, Rebecca Chen, no relation to Marcus's family, to implement a civil response that would ensure complete recovery of my losses and appropriate consequences for everyone involved in the conspiracy. Rebecca was a specialist in elder law and financial abuse cases, and she immediately recognized the potential for substantial civil damages beyond simple recovery of stolen assets. "Eleanor," she said during our initial consultation, "your nephew's professional credentials and sophisticated planning make this case particularly egregious. The fact that he used his real estate expertise to facilitate fraud means we can pursue not just personal damages, but professional sanctions and enhanced penalties. The first priority was recovering my apartment. Rebecca filed emergency court motions demanding immediate restoration of my lease and removal of Jessica Torres from my home. The fraudulent nature of the lease transfer made this legal remedy relatively straightforward, and within 72 hours, I had a court order requiring Frank Morrison to restore my tenancy and providing me with immediate access to my apartment." Walking back into apartment 4B after being locked out was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Jessica Torres had clearly been living there for several weeks, but she'd apparently been instructed to maintain the appearance that the apartment was still mine. My furniture was in place, my belongings were undisturbed, and even my plants had been watered. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jessica said when she opened the door to find me standing there with sheriff's deputies and a court order. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea this wasn't legitimate. Marcus told me you'd moved to a care facility and that the family needed someone to house sit until the apartment could be properly rented." Jessica's obvious distress and immediate cooperation made it clear that she'd been manipulated by Marcus rather than being a knowing participant in the fraud. She packed her belongings quickly and apologetically, repeatedly expressing remorse for her unwitting role in my displacement. "I should have asked more questions," she said as she prepared to leave. "Marcus made it sound like he was helping you transition to better care, but I should have insisted on speaking with you directly." With my apartment restored, I turned my attention to the more complex task of ensuring that Marcus faced consequences proportional to his betrayal. Rebecca's investigation into Marcus's assets revealed that he and Sarah had been living well beyond their reported income, with luxury purchases and lifestyle expenses that suggested they'd been systematically stealing from me for much longer than just the apartment fraud. "Eleanor," Rebecca said, "I think your nephew has been skimming money from your accounts for years. Small amounts that wouldn't be immediately noticeable, but substantial over time. We're talking about potentially $50,000 or more in theft that preceded the apartment scheme." The civil lawsuit we filed sought not just recovery of stolen funds, but punitive damages, professional sanctions, and a comprehensive financial judgment that would ensure Marcus and Sarah faced permanent consequences for their betrayal. But the most satisfying aspect of my response was the professional destruction of Marcus's real estate career. Rebecca's complaint to the Oregon Real Estate Agency detailed how Marcus had used his professional credentials and industry knowledge to facilitate elder abuse and fraud. The complaint triggered an immediate investigation that resulted in suspension of Marcus's license, pending resolution of the criminal charges. "Mrs. Hartwell," the investigator from the real estate agency explained, "agents who use their professional status to commit crimes against vulnerable populations face permanent license revocation and industry blacklisting. Your nephew will never work in real estate again." The investigation also revealed that Marcus had used his access to real estate databases and professional networks to research my apartment's value and rental market conditions as part of his planning for the theft. This professional misconduct elevated his crimes from personal betrayal to industry-wide violations that would be shared with other states' licensing boards. Within 6 weeks of my discovery of the apartment theft, Marcus's carefully constructed life was completely destroyed. His criminal trial was scheduled for the following year, but the evidence was so overwhelming that his attorney advised him to accept a plea agreement rather than face the possibility of decade-long prison sentences. The plea deal required Marcus to serve 18 months in prison, pay full restitution plus punitive damages totaling $200,000, and accept permanent exclusion from any profession involving access to vulnerable populations. Sarah's involvement was less extensive, and she accepted a plea agreement requiring community service, restitution payments, and professional counseling, but avoiding prison time. However, her nursing license was suspended pending completion of ethics training and probationary supervision. The civil lawsuit was settled for $350,000, representing not just recovery of stolen funds, but substantial punitive damages that would ensure Marcus and Sarah spent years rebuilding their financial lives. The settlement also included a permanent restraining order prohibiting any direct or indirect contact with me. But beyond the legal and financial consequences, there was also the deeply satisfying destruction of Marcus's reputation and social standing. David was devastated when he learned the full scope of his son's betrayal, and he publicly disowned Marcus while offering to testify on my behalf during the criminal proceedings. "Eleanor," David said during our emotional conversation after Marcus's arrest, "I am horrified and ashamed that my son could do this to you. Linda would be heartbroken to know what Marcus became despite everything you and Robert did for him." Marcus's colleagues at Premier Properties were equally shocked, and the company issued public statements distancing themselves from his actions and expressing support for elder abuse prevention initiatives. Several of Marcus's former clients contacted me to express their dismay and to share their own concerns about whether Marcus had been honest in his professional dealings with them. The most gratifying consequence was the complete collapse of Marcus and Sarah's social circle. Friends who had celebrated their wedding and envied their lifestyle were appalled by the revelation that their success had been built on systematic theft from an elderly family member who had supported them for decades. "I can't believe we thought they were such an ideal couple," one of their former friends told me when she contacted me to apologize for not recognizing the signs of abuse. Looking back, there were red flags: the expensive house, the luxury, vacations, the designer clothes on their supposed salaries. We should have wondered where all that money was coming from. The Portland real estate community, which had once celebrated Marcus as a rising star, now used his case as a cautionary tale about professional ethics and the importance of background checks and character verification for industry professionals. 6 months after my surgery, I was sitting in my restored apartment, surrounded by the belongings Marcus had planned to liquidate, reviewing thank you notes from other elderly victims who had contacted me after learning about my successful fight against financial abuse. Detective Santos had explained that my case had become a model for how sophisticated elder abuse schemes could be detected and prosecuted, and that the documentation I'd preserved had helped identify similar fraud patterns in other cases. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said during our final meeting, "your willingness to fight back aggressively probably prevented dozens of other families from experiencing similar betrayals. Elder abuse thrives when victims are too ashamed or intimidated to seek help, but your response has shown that these crimes can be successfully prosecuted." The Oregon legislature had also taken notice of my case, with several representatives citing the Marcus Chen fraud as evidence of the need for stronger penalties for financial crimes against elderly victims and better oversight of professionals, with access to vulnerable populations. But the most meaningful outcome was the transformation of my own perspective on aging, independence, and family relationships. The betrayal had been devastating, but fighting back successfully had given me a sense of empowerment and self-confidence that had actually strengthened my ability to live independently. I'd discovered that I was far more capable of protecting myself and managing crisis situations than I'd ever realized. Eleanor, my new financial advisor said during one of our planning sessions, you've demonstrated remarkable resilience and practical intelligence throughout this ordeal. The security measures you've implemented and the support network you've built make you one of the most fraud-resistant clients I've ever worked with. I'd also formed new friendships and community connections through my involvement with elder abuse prevention organizations and victim support groups. The experience had connected me with other survivors who'd become sources of mutual support and advocacy for stronger protection of elderly citizens. Mrs. Patterson from 2A had become a particularly close friend after learning about my experience. Eleanor, she said, watching you fight back against this betrayal has inspired all of us in the building. You've shown that age doesn't mean helplessness, and that family members who think they can take advantage of us are making a serious mistake. The building management had also implemented new security procedures based on my case, requiring additional verification for any lease modifications or access changes, especially when initiated by family members claiming to act on behalf of elderly tenants. 1 year after my surgery, I received a letter from Marcus in prison. It was the first communication I'd had from him since his arrest, and reading it provided a final sense of closure to the most difficult period of my life. Aunt Eleanor, he wrote, I know you'll probably never read this letter, and I understand why you wouldn't want to hear from me. But I needed to tell you that I'm sorry for what I did to you. I can't explain how I became someone who could betray the person who loved me most, but I want you to know that I understand the enormity of what I took from you. Not just your apartment and money, but your trust and sense of security. He continued, I don't expect forgiveness, and I know I can never undo the damage I caused, but I want you to know that losing you has been the worst consequence of my actions. The prison time, the financial ruin, the destroyed career, none of that compares to knowing that I threw away the most important relationship in my life for money I didn't even need. The letter concluded, I hope you're living well and that you found peace despite what I put you through. You deserved so much better from me, and I'm sorry I wasn't worthy of the love and trust you gave me. I read the letter once and then put it away without responding. Marcus's remorse might have been genuine, but it changed nothing about the consequences he'd earned through his betrayal. Some violations of trust are so complete that forgiveness becomes irrelevant compared to the importance of protecting yourself from future harm. 2 years after the surgery that had nearly cost me everything, I was thriving in ways I'd never expected. My apartment had been completely redecorated according to my own preferences rather than Marcus's suggestions. My social life had expanded to include new friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. My financial security had been enhanced by the restitution payments and the improved investment strategies my new advisors had implemented. Most importantly, I'd learned that real family isn't defined by blood relationships or legal obligations, but by mutual respect, genuine care, and consistent support. The people in my life now had earned their place through their actions rather than inheriting it through biological connections. Eleanor, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson said during one of our evening walks along the river, you've become an inspiration to everyone who knows your story. You've shown that it's never too late to fight for justice, and that people who think age makes us vulnerable are sometimes in for a very unpleasant surprise. She was right about that. The 70-year-old woman Marcus had dismissed as a helpless burden had turned out to be someone with the resources, intelligence, and determination to destroy his life as completely as he'd tried to destroy mine. The apartment theft that Marcus had planned as the first step in systematically looting my assets had instead become the catalyst for exposing 20 years of manipulation and setting in motion consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. Standing at my living room window, looking out at the Willamette River and the city where I'd built my life, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. I'd fought for my dignity, my security, and my right to live independently, and I'd won completely. Marcus had learned too late that stealing from someone who'd spent 4 decades dealing with manipulative, entitled people was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. He'd discovered that the elderly woman he'd tried to exploit was actually someone with the knowledge, resources, and determination to ensure that justice was served. If someone in your life is treating you like you're disposable, remember my story. Remember that respect isn't optional, that trust once broken can never be rebuilt, and that people who underestimate you based on your age or circumstances might be making the most expensive mistake of their lives. You're never too old, never too weak, never too powerless to fight for what's rightfully yours. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is when someone pushes you far enough that you finally decide to push back with everything you have. What's your story? Have you ever had to fight back against someone who thought you were helpless? Share it in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories about turning your worst betrayal into your greatest victory. Because sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up teaching you exactly how strong you really are. And sometimes that strength is enough to ensure they never underestimate anyone like you ever again. The surgery was supposed to be the end of my independence. Instead, it became the beginning of the most empowering chapter of my life. Marcus thought he was stealing my home, but what he actually did was help me discover that I was much more powerful than either of us had ever imagined. That's a lesson he'll have plenty of time to think about over the next 18 months. And for the rest of his life, every time he considers taking advantage of someone he thinks is vulnerable, he'll remember the 70-year-old teacher who taught him that some people fight back harder than you ever expected. Justice served. Lesson learned. Power reclaimed. Sometimes the best revenge is simply showing people exactly who they were foolish enough to cross. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.